life and property is compensated with all these factors. Let's look at the urban structure in the Great Seljuks. We see that the towns are made of three parts. There is Kuhandif, the inner castle. The second part is Şehristan, the overall panoramic of the city. And the third part is the external neighborhoods. I mean, the neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city. In all medieval cities, we see the structure. In the most appropriate place of the state, there is Kuhandis, the inner castle. And in the inner castle, there is always a military garrison in the medieval cities. According to certain threads, the medieval cities, in fact, appear to be castle cities with a certain number of doors and gates. These are very wide gates. They keep the gates closed during the nighttime, and during the daytime, they have control over the entries and exits. So for study purposes, for pilgrimage, for touristic purposes, for trade purposes, they can be entries and exits. And during these entries and exits, and also during institute travels, it is necessary to get some official permit. This measure is in relation to ensuring public order. These permissions go into the official records, and some travel certificate is issued upon demand after certain inspections. Traveling, if he is a very well-known person, then a sealed document is given. But if they are just the laymen who are traveling, then they would seal them in their arms, or they would give them some metal lead ID coin that would be hanging on their neck, just like a necklace. And in the medieval cities, there would be long streets in the marketplace, and at the end, at the two ends, there would be two great doors, and they would be closed at night. Before dark hours, the marketplace would be abandoned, and the traders would go back home. People would leave their shops to go home, and then the watch guards would close the gates. They would be walking in the streets together with their watchdogs. They would have torches, and Assas was the name for the night watchman. They would be patrolling in the streets and the marketplaces on hourly basis. They would receive certain remuneration. There were also inns in those cities. In fact, during the night times and evening times, in fact, the night guards would also be guarding the inns. As of the 19th century, also for the purpose of ensuring security, some main roads would be illuminated. And in especially Kurtuba, you see very good examples of illumination and lighting. And some processed copper lighting bulbs would be hanging on the posts, and you see different types of lighting in different regions. In Iran and Iraq, mostly oil-based neft would be used, and in Syria and Egypt, some oily candles would be used. And in Egypt, mostly the sesame oil would be used. Let's look at the organization once again. In order to set public order and in order to counter crime, there was this organization called Shurta. It was a responsible organization. There would be a president, and it would be called Sahibi Shurta. It means owner of the Shurta. And also for the administrative correspondence, there was the secretary, and there were the Shurtis. They were the assistants and deputies to the Shurta. The Shurta organization also had some subunits, guards, guardians, security forces, execution officers, night watchers, assassins, and intelligence officers, patrolling officers. Other units are the subunits. In fact, in terms of protocol, Shurta was at the same level as Qadi. and they were wearing some specially prepared uniform. They would be called hilfat, and they would tie a belt, matuka, and they would wear shasiye, that is a thin headscarf, and they would also have a black sarkosh on their head. And the shurtis, when they were parading, officially they would wear iza, that is a shirt. In fact, it doesn't have a collar, and it is a bit wide, and also they would wear a dish touch. This is a male dress. It is a part of Arabic culture, and they would also wear a belt. That's a special uniform. On their uniform and on their belt, they would be carrying some long daggers, and on the daggers they would carry the emblems that would show their rank. The shurtis during operations and campaigns, they would also wear the helmets and arms with special emblems, and they would also wear some special military shoes. It would be called charmo, and they would be equipped with certain weapons. That is mostly a long dagger, and they had a special weapon, kafir kubbat. It is similar to a sword. It is mostly used during battle time. It is like a sickle. They would also carry their whip, and shurta dates back to Ali the Caliph, and then there were different formats. The shurta organization would report to the Qadi later on, or to the provincial governor. For example, under the Merini in the Islamic dynasty in North Africa, in their dynasty in Andalus, shurta would report to Hajib. And in time, it turned into an organization reporting to the Sultan, and later on the Caliph himself. And let's look at the elements included in their functions. They would undertake some jurisdiction functions, and they were administering the jails. They were responsible for overall public order. They were responsible for the interrogations, investigations. They were helping the Qadi, the judge, and they were enforcing the decisions and orders of the Qadi. They were responsible for the customs duty operations, and if necessary, they would join the war. That was part of their function, and all their functions would be fulfilled in close communication with the constable, muhtasib, and Qadi. So for the postal organization and the intelligence organization, in fact, in Devan Berit board, there were seats, and shurta was part of that divan, that board, together with the other units. And in Egypt, Fusta, and in El Asker, in two parts of Egypt, there were two shurta headquarters established in Islamic cities. The shurta buildings would be mostly next to other security and jurisdiction areas. So they would be mostly in the administrative part of the city, and they would stay together with the other administrators of the town. In pre-Islamic and Muslim Turkic states, there were subashis who were responsible for the public order and security, and that was originating from the Turkish military tradition. In fact, subashi and shurta organizations are similar, and later on they brought together under one organization in the following states, and they shared roles. In Syria, this different. Interestingly, shurta and subashi institutions, in fact, didn't become widespread. That was unlike other Islamic states. But, public order and security were ensured by ahdas. That is a different institution. It was unique. It had its own characteristics. In fact, ahdas would be executed and enforced by some well-known families. It is mostly in Al Jazeera. In Diyarbakir, there is a dynasty called Nisanoğulları. And in fact, this is also an ahdas organization. It's a dynasty, but it's an ahdas organization. They filled in the gap, and then they turned into a small feudal prince territory. During in Delhi Kölemens in India, in fact, public order and enforcement rules would be shared by Emirdağ Şanı. In the Turkish Selçuks, the ports and coasts were secured by the postal commander. Bahattin Muhammad, in fact, was giving this appointment. They had specific training and they were holding the offices for a certain time. In time, there was corruption and also abuse of power. Then the offenders would be reprimanded, they would be dismissed, and sometimes they would be imprisoned. And if there was any embezzlement of bribery, then they would be given those penalties in addition to the seizure of property. In fact, in Nizam al-Mulk, the famous Selçuk Vezir, in fact, talked about the signs of corruption. In fact, he wrote the 40th chapter of his famous collection of works as a recommendation of the sultans, and it included those signs of corruption. In the medieval age, what were the most popular threats? It was usurp, stealing, the Baghdadi rival, looting, unrest, and also some fight between different denominations. The Abbasi Caliphate, before it disappeared, in fact, there were some a civil unrest that was led by ayyas. They mostly have a job, but they are not representing a profession. Members of trade and tradesmen would be, in fact, there. But that organization is very interestingly an anti-trade organization. In fact, they didn't intervene with the weak, with the women, with children. They had some moral principles, and they felt like a cavalier working alone in the woods, and they were just fighting against the enemy voluntarily in the rural. However, in Baghdad, in major cities, metropolitan cities, in fact, they were always in conflict with the capitalists and also the security forces. So it's just like that organization had two faces. One is good and one is bad. With the emergence of anarchy, Shurta organization and in the equivalent organizations, in fact, there was higher importance. Ibn Kassir talks about a looting event that took place in 1339. In fact, there were some explosives used then. We don't know the triggering mechanism, but it was the Tamaj acid. It was 1339, year 1339. It's interesting. So now I can read a paragraph from Ibn Kassir in order to describe what happened in that specific year. And then I will conclude. Well, he says the following. A group of Christian leaders just gathered in their own church. They collected some money internally in Damascus, 1339. And for preparation of explosives, spying, they had all the knowledge. And in fact, they gave the money to two priests, two fathers who had all the information about terrorism, the explosives, etc. In fact, the explosives would show the impacts only after 4 or 5 hours. In fact, towards the evening hours, they just placed the bombs, the explosives in a hole, in a niche in the wall.
Geceleyin karanlık bastırınca insanlar aniden dükkanlarının bulunduğu yerden alevler yükselmekte olduğunu gördüler.
And then after some time, people saw the flames coming. In fact, the Umayyad mosque's east minaret was set on fire. The representatives of the Sultan and all others were there. And later on, the fire just expanded, and the houses and the schools were affected by the fire as well. The aim was to put the Umayyad mosque fire as well. So that was a collective action of the Christians, and that was looting. And once the authorities understood that the reason for the looting, in fact, was Christians, and the authorities just arrested 60 people. They were tortured, they were penalized, and more than 10 Christian leaders were killed, and their dead bodies were burnt down. In conclusion, I'd like to say that there are certain dynamics of public security and order in the medieval cities. One tradition is originating from Islam. Shurta is an example. And the second branch is originating from Central Asia, Turkish tradition. And there are also regional traditions, just like Ahdas. Fourth arm is related to the needs. All these needs were also shaping the institutions. Their mandate and jurisdiction would be overlapping sometimes, but in practice there was no chaos among the institutions. In terms of security, these institutions would collaborate with other units, and they would be working in coordination. That's all for my presentation. I hereby conclude my presentation.